In a post on his social network, Truth Social, the president wrote, "Wow, Canada has just announced that it's backing statehood for Palestine. That will make it very hard for us to make a trade deal with them. Oh, Canada," he writes.
Donald Trump thought he was delivering the final blow. On August 1st, he signed a sweeping 35% tariff on Canadian imports, turning a tense standoff into an all-out trade war. It was a political stunt wrapped in economic devastation, announced with fanfare, flags, and fury. The goal? Cripple Canada's economy, force Prime Minister Mark Carney to the table, and parade another America First victory in front of cameras. But this time, the script flipped. Carney didn't panic. He didn't retaliate with rage. He didn't even hold a press conference. Instead, he walked away with strategic silence, legal leverage, and a playbook that left Trump politically exposed and economically cornered. In a stunning turn, Canada sidestepped the tariffs' full impact, weaponized the very trade deal Trump once bragged about, and pulled a diplomatic maneuver that shocked even America's closest allies. By recognizing Palestinian statehood at the height of the tariff dispute, Carney reframed a narrative, drawing international attention away from Trump's bluster and toward Canada's moral clarity. What looked like a one-sided ambush turned into a masterclass in restraint, resilience, and retaliation. And in the end, it wasn't Canada that blinked. It was Trump. It started like most of Trump's political plays, loud, theatrical, and timed for maximum impact. The announcement came just before noon on August 1st. Surrounded by steel executives and flanked by massive American flags, Trump declared that the United States would impose a 35% tariff on Canadian goods, effective immediately. His tone was celebratory. His message was clear. Canada had been cheating the U.S. for decades, and now he claimed America was finally fighting back. What he didn't say, however, is that this move wasn't rooted in any new data or trade infraction. It was retaliation, purely political. Canada had been dragging its feet on a new bilateral energy deal. Carney had declined to visit Washington after multiple requests. And worse for Trump, Canada had quietly begun negotiating deeper economic ties with European Union and Japan, bypassing U.S. dominance entirely. Trump saw the tariff as a punishment, a show of dominance. But Canada saw it as something else entirely, an opportunity to prove it no longer needed America's economic approval. Within hours of the announcement, U.S. media erupted. The Dow dipped, Canadian exporters panicked, and headlines screamed of a potential economic war. But in Ottawa, silence. No immediate press conferences. No fiery rebuttals. Just a quiet, coordinated strategy session between Prime Minister Carney, Foreign Minister Melanie Joly, Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland, and Ontario Premier Doug Ford. While Trump shouted, Canada calculated. By August 2nd, internal leaks revealed what the Canadian side was preparing, a multi-layered counter-response grounded not in emotion, but in trade law. The first card? USMCA, the very agreement Trump had once called the greatest trade deal ever made. But buried in that same agreement was a clause that would now become Canada's shield. Article 232 of the USMCA included a safeguard provision. If national security tariffs were imposed, member nations could appeal through a bilateral panel. And even more critically, a 2024 review of the deal had led to revisions, championed by none other than Doug Ford, that reclassified certain Canadian exports, including aluminum and key minerals, under strategic necessity. This made them legally exempt from sudden tariff hikes, unless national security could be proven beyond doubt. Trump's 35% tariff had just hit a legal wall. Overnight, 95% of Canadian exports to the U.S. were now outside the reach of this tariff, not because Trump changed his mind, but because Carney and his team had anticipated this play months ago. Quietly, methodically, they had restructured Canada's export classification under the USMCA umbrella. What the U.S. thought was a knockout punch barely scratched the surface. Meanwhile, Carney made no televised statements. Instead, his office released a short 82-word briefing. Canada is committed to its international obligations, its domestic resilience, and its long-standing trade partnerships. No further comment. That single line, no further comment, wasn't a dodge. It was a trap. Trump wanted outrage. He needed it. His political strategy hinged on provoking a Canadian overreaction that he could spin into a win. Instead, he got ice-cold indifference, wrapped in legal complexity, and backed by airtight strategy. By August 3rd, the narrative was already shifting. Analysts on both sides of the border, began dissecting Canada's silence as tactical brilliance. American outlets from CNBC to The Atlantic started asking, did Trump just outplay himself? What was supposed to be a humiliating blow to Canada was starting to look like a miscalculation. Then came Carney's next move, the diplomatic bombshell no one saw coming. On August 4th, Canada officially recognized Palestinian statehood, citing a need for global consistency in human rights and international law. But the timing was anything but coincidental. The announcement came less than 72 hours after Trump's tariff bombshell, and it had nothing to do with Middle Eastern diplomacy. It was about spotlight theft. With one press release, Carney shifted global attention from Trump's economic war to Canada's moral stance. Suddenly, Canada was trending across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, not as a victim of American aggression, but as a sovereign actor asserting global leadership. The backlash against the U.S. was immediate and intense. The Arab League praised Canada's courage. European Parliament members began calling for closer trade ties with Ottawa. Meanwhile, Washington was left scrambling to explain how a tariff war turned into a diplomatic embarrassment. By August 5th, Trump's team was forced to clarify that the tariffs were temporary and might be subject to review, depending on Canada's cooperation in future talks. It was a half step back, a signal that pressure was mounting. But Canada wasn't budging. Instead, Carney let the pressure build. Because behind the scenes, Canada was preparing the second half of its response, a coordinated campaign to reduce U.S. procurement, reroute critical supply chains, and accelerate domestic investment in sectors like aluminum, aerospace, and agri-tech. It wasn't just damage control. It was economic retaliation dressed in self-reliance. Carney wasn't just walking away from the negotiating table. He was building a new one without the U.S. at the head. By the second week of August, Canada's strategy had shifted from legal defense to targeted offense. The retaliation wasn't loud. It was logistical. Procurement contracts with U.S.-based companies were quietly suspended. Federal departments began prioritizing bids from domestic manufacturers or international suppliers outside the U.S. supply chains that once flowed freely across the border were now being redirected toward Europe, Asia, and Canada's own industrial heartland. Premier Doug Ford, long seen as a conservative ally to U.S. interests, became a surprising champion of this pivot. In a speech to Ontario's manufacturing sector, Ford declared, "We're done being bullied. We're done being dependent. Ontario builds for Ontario now and for the world, not just Washington." The symbolism was powerful, but the economics were even more decisive. Billions of dollars once earmarked for U.S. imports, everything from aluminum to rail components, were now staying home. Carney's government launched a $6 billion resilience fund to fast-track domestic production in vulnerable sectors, effectively turning Trump's tariff into a subsidy for Canadian industry. What was supposed to hurt now fueled a manufacturing revival. And while Trump was still making headlines with angry tweets and cable news interviews, Canada was making deals. Within days of recognizing Palestinian statehood, Carney secured fast-track trade discussions with Germany, South Korea, and the United Arab Emirates. These weren't just symbolic gestures. They were economic lifelines being rethreaded, trading U.S. volatility for global reliability. The United States, meanwhile, was beginning to feel the pinch. American exporters who relied on Canadian buyers, particularly in agriculture, automotive components, and tech, began reporting sudden order cancellations. Small manufacturers in Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania were hit hardest. By mid-August, trade associations were warning of job losses, factory shutdowns, and deep uncertainty in regional supply networks. And then came the political cost. Trump's tariff move, intended to project strength, was unraveling in real time. His approval ratings in key Rust Belt states, where many small factories rely on Canadian partnerships, began to drop. Union leaders who had cautiously supported Trump's trade agenda were now publicly questioning his strategy. Canada didn't need to twist the knife. The U.S. economy was doing it for them. But Carney wasn't done. While his public posture remained restrained, his government was setting the groundwork for something even more transformative: energy independence from the U.S. Alberta, backed by federal funds, accelerated pipeline partnerships with Japan and South Korea. LNG terminals in British Columbia were fast-tracked to shift export routes from westward to Trans-Pacific, bypassing American ports and regulatory interference altogether. For decades, the U.S. had been the default partner in North American energy. Now it was being phased out one terminal, one contract, 1 megawatt at a time. And all this started with a tariff. The brilliance of Carney's play wasn't just in the moves themselves. It was in the timing. He let Trump swing first and miss. Then he responded not with fury, but with frictionless momentum. While Trump chased headlines, Canada built leverage. And when the global press turned to cover a Palestinian recognition story, they also had to reckon with a larger truth. Canada had just exposed the fragility of American dominance. Even longtime allies took notice. France praised Canada's measured, principled response. India's Ministry of External Affairs issued a rare statement supporting Canada's right to trade without intimidation. The EU accelerated a procurement deal with Ottawa, signaling deeper economic realignment. Meanwhile, Trump's cabinet was in damage control mode. Internal memos leaked to the press reveal that senior economic advisors had warned against the 35% tariff, citing potential unintended consequences with core allies. But Trump had overruled them, personally. He didn't expect Carney to play the long game. He didn't expect global sympathy to shift north. And he certainly didn't expect his America First move to isolate America in its own backyard. What started as a single tariff became something far bigger, a referendum on U.S. behavior in the post-Trump order. By the end of August, Trump's administration had stopped using the word tariff altogether. White House spokespeople began floating terms like temporary measures and ongoing reviews. It was a retreat without a formal surrender, because admitting defeat wasn't an option. But everyone saw it. The markets saw it. The voters saw it. And Canada capitalized on it. Not by gloating, not by broadcasting a victory parade, but by walking away, with power intact, alliances strengthened, and industry reawakened. Carney never needed to win a shouting match. He just needed to prove that Canada wouldn't kneel. And in doing so, he redefined what strength looks like in a trade war. Not loud, not erratic, but relentless, strategic, and quiet enough to be underestimated until it's too late. Trump thought he could bend Canada to his will with a single stroke of a pen. But what he underestimated wasn't just Canada's economy, it was Canada's will. Mark Carney didn't march to Washington. He didn't pick up the phone. He didn't shout. He walked away, with leverage in one hand and global respect in the other. This wasn't just a trade dispute. It became a referendum on leadership. Trump's explosive, short-term theatrics versus Carney's long-term, calculated resilience. And in the end, it wasn't the louder voice that won. It was the quieter one that built an exit strategy, rewrote alliances, and emerged stronger. Canada didn't just survive the 35% tariff, it used it as fuel. From restructured procurement to new trade routes, from energy independence to geopolitical positioning, Canada exposed something that should terrify every ally who depends on U.S. stability. Washington doesn't play fair, and it doesn't play long. So now the question isn't what happens next for Canada. It's what happens next for America. Will Trump double down? Will the U.S. find itself increasingly isolated? Or will other nations begin taking pages from Carney's playbook, responding not with anger, but with cold, hard leverage? Because in this new era of global politics, sometimes the smartest move isn't to fight back. It's to walk away.